grabbed hold of the toilet handle and flushed, only it didn't flush. It exploded. The entire toilet shattered into hundreds of tiny pieces of porcelain.
Hell no.
Each one.
What it is, guys? It's your boy BlastphamousHD, and today we are here to check out a video you guys sent to me in the DMs of the Discord. Dumb ways to die. More at 11.
I've never been skiing because when someone says vacation, I think of warm, sunny beaches, not freezing my tushy off on a mountain. And I recently saw a horrifying video that only put me off further. Back in April 2022, an experienced skier was hitting the slopes in the French Alps when this happened.
Oh le con!
Whoa. The man plummeted straight through the ice into a deep crevasse and dropped down a terrifying 49 feet before managing to wedge his skis in and scrape to a stop on a thin ledge. Ooh, I'm getting chills just looking at that. Thanks to a heap of luck and a skilled team of fellow skiers, this guy was pulled out of the icy hellhole by a rope and pulley. But the whole process took hours. He wasn't alone in his traumatic experience either. Because 2022 was warmer than usual, more people took to the slopes and crevasse falls rose drastically from around 38 a year to 70. Sadly, 6 of those 70 never made it back out, which makes our boy's incredible escape that much more impressive. That's a whole load of nopes to the slopes from me. A rough commute. A daily commute into work can be long, cramped, and boring. In April 2022, however, one commuter ended up in a situation so terrifying you wouldn't wish it on your worst enemy. The woman was waiting for a train at a station in Buenos Aires, Argentina, when she suddenly started feeling lightheaded. People around her watched in horror as she stumbled forward and fell over straight into the path of the moving train. Surely, that was the end of her. It certainly looked like it. The woman didn't just hit the moving carriage, she disappeared beneath it entirely. The train screeched to a halt and a huge crowd gathered around the spot where she'd fallen, but there was no sign of her. That is, until they heard somebody calling for help. What? She was alive? Unbelievably, the woman had slid mere inches beneath the carriage as they raced above her, and was pressed to the side of the platform edge. Just a moment later, and she'd have been a human smoothie. Astonished, the witnesses pulled her back out, and were even more astonished to see she was mostly unharmed. After going to the hospital, the doctors told her she'd experienced a freak drop in blood pressure, which had led to the fall. But after just a couple of days, she was right as rain again. Or should I say, right as train. I'll see myself out.
That's a good one.
Between falling down a crevasse and falling down beside a moving train, which fall did you think was scarier? For the crevasse, hit that like button, and for the train, hit subscribe.
Crevasse.
All done. Great. What weird and wild escape from fate have we got next? Rest in peace room. Okay, I'm not proud of it, but I've left my toilet in a state that would scare even Pennywise the clown. But it's never been dangerous. However, when 58-year-old New Yorker Michel Pierre went to the bathroom one fateful day in 2013, he couldn't have known the terror that was about to befall him. After finishing up, Michel grabbed hold of the toilet handle and flushed, only it didn't flush. It exploded. The entire toilet shattered into hundreds of tiny pieces of porcelain, each one shooting in a different direction like a giant poopy grenade. The shock of the blast sent Michel flying backwards into the opposite wall, knocking him unconscious. When he awoke, he was lying in a pool of water and broken porcelain. Shocked, hurt, but thankfully very much alive, Michel called emergency services and was taken to hospital where he got 30 stitches and made a full recovery. Alright, so what the heck happened? Well, it wasn't an evil toilet clown. Turns out, water to the building had been shut off for plumbing work that day. Because of the work they were doing, when Michel flushed the toilet, it created a huge buildup of pressure in the pipe, which burst not only Michel's toilet, but 3 others in the building too. Man,
Damn.
I'm used to explosions in the restroom, but not ones that come from the toilet itself. Lumberjack. Trees are one of Earth's most precious resources. Vital lifelines that pump oxygen into the air and keep us alive. They can also be incredibly dangerous. Something Canadian tree feller Jeremy Cadotte found out the hard way back in 2017. Jeremy was sawing a particularly big tree down when he suddenly heard a loud cracking sound.
Thunder? Run, bitch!
Cripes. One wrong move and they'd have needed a spatula to peel him off the floor. It looks like the base of the tree was rotten, something Jeremy didn't realize until he sawed deep into it. Because of the rot, the trunk was weak and split vertically up the middle, something called a barber chair, after the old barber chairs that used to position a person's head back and feet up. By sheer chance, our boy jumped the right way, though, and saved himself from a nasty demise. What tremendous luck. Chalksplosion. Ever since reading Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory when I was a kid, I've always loved the idea of working in one. Turns out, though, the reality is less oompa loompa doopity doo and more, oh geez, help, I'm gonna die. Or at least it was for Pennsylvanian chocolate factory worker Patricia Borge back in April 2023. It was an ordinary day at the factory, apart from one thing. There was a strange smell of gas in the air. Patricia reported it to her supervisor, but they just said someone higher up would deal with it. Big mistake. Just 30 minutes later, a huge explosion ripped through the factory and sent the whole place up in flames. The blast set Patricia alight. Panicking, she started to run, but the floor gave way beneath her and she plummeted into a huge vat of liquid chocolate in the basement. The liquid in the vat was only chest high, but it had extinguished the flames and broken her fall enough to save her life. However, she'd also broken her feet on impact and was far too short to climb out of the vat. She was trapped. Firefighters arrived to put out the flames, but they couldn't see Patricia or hear her cries for help. Water from their hoses gradually poured in from above, and Patricia managed to use the rising water level in the vat to climb out. Then she heaved herself over the edge, fell again, and fell in a waist-deep pool of water on the basement floor. Unable to walk, she clutched onto a bit of plastic tubing and screamed for help. Nobody came. Hours passed like this. However, just as she was giving up hope, a team of rescuers found her. Battered, freezing cold, and confused, Patricia was carried out of the factory and taken to hospital, where, thankfully, she's expected to make a full recovery. Whew!
Damn!
I don't know about Willy Wonka, but that was an absolutely bonkers story of survival. Blunder Blade. Some people absolutely love DIY. Me, though, not a fan. And it's all because of videos like these. Yeah, so this guy was using something called an angle grinder, essentially a spinning blade used for cutting metal. If you think that sounds dangerous, you're completely right. Supposedly, halfway through using it, the blade broke, flew off, and got lodged in his hat. Holy moly. If that corduroy bucket hat hadn't been there, it would have gone straight into his head. Wait, would a bucket hat really stop a speeding blade? I mean, it's very unlikely, but possible, I suppose. But if we look at this shot here, we can see that he was using a tool with his right hand. When it switches to his face, it looks like the blade is in the right side of his hat. But look at the text on it. The image has been flipped. If we flip it back, we can see it's actually on his left side. I guess he could have been using it with his left hand. But if the blade sheared off mid-spin, would some fabric really have been enough to stop it? Really convenient, seeing as he's not wearing any other safety equipment. A little too convenient, if you ask me. Personally, I think this video's been staged for TikTok clout. But what do you think? Let me know down in the comments. Resistance. The brain is a remarkable organ. Not only is it responsible for everything we do and feel, it can also keep working despite major injury. And back in 2016, one unfortunate 12-year-old girl from India found this out the hard and very gross way. She'd been suffering from seizures, headaches, and general weakness for over 2 years, but nobody knew why. Then her symptoms suddenly got so bad, she became paralyzed down the right side of her body and couldn't even feed herself. Her parents rushed her to hospital where she had an MRI scan, and doctors made a horrifying discovery. A tapeworm larva had been living inside a cyst in her head for almost 10 years.
What?
Ugh. Nita probably ate the larva when it was smaller in some contaminated food, then made its way to her brain and began growing there. The cyst had gotten so huge that it weighed over 1.5 pounds. It was so big, it was nearly the size of her entire brain. Oh, that is horrendous. Doctors were astonished. The giant growth could have ruptured at any point and ended her life instantly, but by some miracle, it hadn't. Because it was so close to her brain, though, it had caused a whole bunch of issues, which meant her paralysis endured. There was only one thing to it: surgery. Incredibly, after a 2.5-hour operation, the cyst was successfully removed intact, and Nita pulled through. 2 weeks later, all her symptoms had disappeared. Wow. Nita's now an ordinary girl again, enjoying life to its fullest. Driving near disasters.
That's what's up.
You're smart. You don't need me to tell you why driving can be dangerous, I hope. But there are far more risks to the road than you might imagine. Like, I don't know, trees randomly collapsing as you drive past. Cripes. A second earlier and that driver would have been a goner. Yep, nature can be a very cruel mistress. As one man from Kenya will testify, in May 2023, the Galana River flooded and rushed into his truck, overturning it and leaving him stranded amidst the rising waters for over 6 hours. Thankfully, the Sheldrick wild trucks come with their own set of risks, especially if you're driving behind them. In Florida, back in 2018, one woman was driving down Interstate 95 when a plywood sheet in the truck in front of her came loose and flew backwards, smashing straight through her windscreen. By sheer luck, the sheet didn't touch her, but it had gotten terrifyingly close to her neck. It's a miracle she managed to stop the vehicle before losing control. See, the truck driver hadn't tied down the sheet properly. And it's a problem plaguing more than just pickup drivers. TikToker Allo420 posted the following video after a similar accident happened while he was driving behind a log truck.
Easy, and with savings that fit right into her.
You're crazy, boy.
USAA.com.
Final destination.
Yeah, literally.
That's a final destination.
So this is a general service announcement to anyone hauling anything on trucks. Double, triple, then quadruple check that your loads are secure. Hey, quintuple, sextuple, and septuple check it if you got time. I wouldn't even be mad at an octuple check. But even if you never drive behind another truck again, you could still end up in some sticky situations. One of my viewers was driving past a truck when the brake pad flew off the wheel, and, you guessed it, hit their windscreen. They slammed on the brakes and thankfully the pad broke free without injuring anybody. But it just goes to show you can never be truly prepared. Something nobody knows more than Mauricio Henao from California. Mauricio was sitting parked below a hillside near his house when his girlfriend called him and told him to go back in their home to check something. Mauricio got out of the car and walked back into the house, but as soon as he crossed the threshold, there was a loud rumbling followed by an even louder crash. Shocked, Mauricio turned around and was horrified at what he saw. A huge rock was buried in the roof of his car, completely crushing it. It had fallen down the hill in a landslide, and if his girlfriend had called him just moments later, it would have smashed right into him.
Ooh.
Ugh. Talk about a rocky start to the day. A close shave. Sometimes I hear a story that stuns me as much as it makes my stomach churn. This is one of those stories. In a small Indian village in Uttar Pradesh, a young woman called Taiba went out for a walk. While wandering, she came across a construction site and, intrigued, decided to explore it. This, it turns out, was a very bad move. The place was littered with rocks and half-finished structures, and Taiba wasn't being super careful where she was looking. Suddenly, she tripped and landed neck first on a long metal rod that was protruding from a brick. Luckily, however, there were people nearby who saw the whole thing happen. They ran to get help, and it wasn't long before paramedics came to the shocking scene. But she needed to be taken to the hospital. When they got there, the doctors were gobsmacked. By some miracle, the rod had missed all of the vital nerves and blood vessels in her head. The docs got to work gradually pulling it out, and after 35 grueling minutes, it was over. Amazingly, Taiba survived and was discharged just 3 days later without any lasting consequences. Wow, my jaw just hit the floor. Luckily, there were no metal rods down there. A girl's best friend. Back in 2012, following an ordeal that's too shocking to discuss on YouTube without getting demonetized, a woman named Michalina Kozaprak found herself tied up and locked in darkness inside a cardboard box buried in the ground. Upon realizing the reality of her situation, trying to keep her breathing as shallow as possible to preserve oxygen, she began frantically thinking for a way to escape. Suddenly, she remembered. She was wearing her engagement ring. The diamond was set so that it stood out of the ring, which she could use as a very basic cutting tool. With a desperate determination, she started cutting away at the binds around her wrists and eventually managed to break through them. Now it was time for the box, but proved tougher than it looked. But after an enormous effort and countless punches and scratches, Michalina managed to punch through. Dirt fell down on her face and clothes, and with one final burst of strength, she smashed out of the hole and saw the sky again. There was no sweeter sight. Exhausted, but very much alive, she clambered out of the box, staggered to the road, and flagged down a motorist who called the police. The individual responsible for all this was arrested shortly afterwards and sentenced to 20 years in prison. Good riddance. A whole lot of strength, perseverance, and willpower got Michalina out of that hole. But if she didn't have her engagement ring, it could have been a very different story. I guess diamonds really are a girl's best friend. Cobalt out of there. As far as jobs go, history has shown that mining is one of the worst. Aside from the long hours and persistent danger, the conditions are unpleasant to say the least. Claustrophobic, damp, cold. It's akin to a tomb down there. But in some parts of the world, people are still forced to brave terrible conditions and go down into the mines to scrape a living, like cobalt miners in the Congo. Cobalt is an important metal used to make batteries, and the Congo has over 70% of the world's supply. In other words, it's big business. The problem is, mining operations are plagued with human rights issues, corruption, and poor safety standards. Back in March 2023, a group of miners were working underground when the worst thing possible happened. The mine collapsed on top of them. Trapped and pinned down in a tiny pitch-black cavern with the ceiling crumbling in by the second, things looked dire. This may sound like a nightmare, but it's a very real way many miners meet their end. Officially, more than 15,000 miners perish every year. But that number is likely much higher with all the undeclared accidents that occur. Some estimates put that figure closer to the hundreds of thousands. Those are not good odds. Luckily for our miners, there were other workers on the surface. They jumped heroically into action and started digging wildly at the ground with their hands. But there wasn't much time. The mine was in the side of a hill, and the collapse had destabilized the ground farther up, causing rocks to come hurtling down directly at the rescuers. Undeterred, they kept digging, and thanks to some deft dodging worthy of Muhammad Ali, they broke through without being hit. Amazingly, all 9 of the buried miners came bursting out of the occluded mine entrance one by one and were pulled to safety. Whew! Even so, I'd highly consider a career change.
Yeah.
Window pane. I love the feeling of flying. I adore it. Can't get enough of it. Some people, however, aren't so keen. And after I heard about British Airways Flight 5390, I can see why. It all started a couple of days before the airplane was due to take off. While performing scheduled maintenance, the shift manager realized the captain's side windscreen needed to be replaced. So he set to work doing so. Only he stupidly hadn't read the plane's instruction manual and used the wrong screws to screw it back in with, ones that were too narrow to hold the panes in. But after self-certifying his own work, the plane was cleared to fly. Oh boy. 2 days later, 81 passengers and 6 crew boarded the plane in Birmingham, UK, ready to travel to Malaga. Little did they know, they were about to have the most terrifying journey of their lives. Everything started out normally. 10 minutes after takeoff, the 2 co-pilots, Captain Lancaster and First Officer Alistair Atchison, were in the cockpit with their flight attendant, Nigel Ogden, while the cabin crew prepared for food service. Then, the plane hit 17,300 feet, and everything changed. At this altitude, the pressure difference between the outside and inside was too much for the poorly installed side window. The screws holding it in place popped off, and the entire pane flew off. Immediately, the whole plane erupted into chaos. The decompression tore the cockpit door off its hinges and slammed straight into the throttle levers, blocking them. Even worse, Captain Lancaster was pulled halfway out of the plane, where he remained pinned with his feet still inside, pushing against the control column.
Oh my God.
Ogden rushed to his aid and, luckily, grabbed hold of his legs just in time to stop him flying out. But that wasn't the only problem. Because Lancaster's feet were pushing against the control column, the autopilot disconnected and the plane plunged into a nosedive. And with the throttle levers blocked, Atchison couldn't do anything to stop it. The plane was shooting back down to earth like a speeding bullet. Atchison desperately tried to radio in help, but wind was whipping so violently around the cabin that he couldn't hear anything. Suddenly, 2 more flight attendants fought their way into the cockpit and stamped on the door, breaking it in 2. The throttles were free. Then they rushed to aid Ogden, who by now was suffering from frostbite and struggling to hold on to the captain. With the controls free, Atchison managed to get the plane under control, but it looked like it was too late for Lancaster. The captain's body had slid round the side of the plane, and now he was face first against the window. His skin was gray and his eyes wide and unblinking, but they couldn't release him in case he was thrown into the engines, which would bring the plane down. Eventually, Atchison slowed the plane to a reasonable enough speed that he could attempt a landing. However, he was over Southampton, a city he was utterly unfamiliar with. Relying purely on the guidance of an air traffic controller, and without his captain, Atchison pulled off what he thought impossible. He landed the plane. Not only that, but he landed it safely with all 81 passengers shaken, but unharmed. Wow. The crew weren't so lucky, with injuries ranging from frostbite to a dislocated shoulder, but that's nowhere near as bad as it could have been. And then, there was Captain Lancaster. He'd been pinned outside the plane amid brutal 370-mile-per-hour winds in freezing temperatures as cold as 1 degree Fahrenheit. Yet within just a few minutes of touchdown, he opened his eyes. Incredibly, against all odds, the man was alive.
The fuck?
After being rushed to hospital, he was treated for frostbite and bone fractures, then made a full recovery. The fact he survived is nothing short of a medical miracle. The whole incident sparked off a huge investigation and led to an overhaul in the way maintenance staff are trained. So don't worry, it should never happen again. Not that it put Lancaster off. Within just 5 months, he was back flying jets. Crikey, if I was him, I'd be keeping my 2 feet firmly on the ground. Low point. I can't think of many words more commonly associated with accidents than heavy and machinery. I also can't think of any accident as horrendous as the one I'm about to tell you about. Get ready, because this is intense. Back in 2008, 25-year-old factory worker Matthew Lowe was working beside a computer-controlled conveyor near Barnsley, UK, when his overalls got caught in the machinery. Before he could react, he was dragged back and pinned to the conveyor, which was rolling straight towards a tiny 5-inch gap in the machine. He panicked. There was nowhere else for his body to go, and his overalls were still firmly entangled. He'd be completely crushed. At the last second, he noticed a slightly bigger gap just below the tiny one and quickly pushed his head through it. But it was too late for the rest of him. You know a CD case? Imagine your entire body getting pulled through a hole the size of one. I can't imagine what that must have sounded like, let alone felt like. The machine chewed Matthew up like he was made of polystyrene and spat him out on the floor. His clothes were tattered and almost all the bones in his body were completely broken. Yet somehow he was still alive and even conscious. That's when the pain hit. He screamed. Some of his fellow workers rushed to his aid and called an ambulance. When the paramedics came, they couldn't believe Matthew was still breathing. He was a total mess. As carefully as they could, they put him on a stretcher and took him to a hospital. But the ordeal was far from over. The surgery required for such a serious case involved pinning his shattered bones back together piece by piece with metal rods. And I mean lots of metal rods. All in all, doctors had to perform 6 operations before Matthew was whole again. Miraculously, though, he pulled through, and 18 months later, he'd made a near full recovery.
Oh my God.
What? Yeah, incredibly,
Oh
he
my
escaped
God.
the ordeal with only some slight arm issues to show for it. Perhaps even more surprisingly, he went back to work with the same company.
Motherfucker.
Jeez. At the very least, I hope they didn't make him wear any overalls.
Luck isn't something you can count on, but sometimes it strikes when you need it most. I'm not just talking about finding $1 or dodging traffic, but 1 in a million events that'll make you say, what are the odds? Stay tuned for some more seriously fortunate people
hell
who survived the impossible.
That dude survived playing the guitar, the ukulele.
Vesna Vulovic.
Oh.
On the evening of January 26, 1972, a man named Bruno Honky discovered the wreckage of an airplane on a hillside just outside his village in Czechoslovakia.
Honky dog?
It seemed impossible that anyone could have survived
is
such
his name?
destruction until he noticed a shoeless woman in a turquoise flight attendant's uniform hidden among the wreckage. Vesna Vulovic.
Another
Little
honky.
did she know, she had just set a new world
they gonna
record,
get married, so
surviving
then they
the
names gonna
highest
be
fall
honky
without a parachute.
together.
In fact, then 22-year-old Vulovic had fallen 33,330 feet out of the sky, suffering 2 broken legs, 3 broken vertebrae, a fractured pelvis, broken ribs, and a fractured skull.
Oh, God.
Vulovic had been a flight attendant for just 8 months before the fateful crash, and she was only aboard JAT Flight 367 from Stockholm to Belgrade because she was confused for another attendant named Vesna. Just 46 minutes into the flight, there was an explosion in the baggage compartment, which caused the plane to enter a fateful nosedive. When the fuselage broke apart, Vulovic was pinned by a food cart, which stopped her being sucked out of the plane. Physicians had advised Vulovic against a career as a flight attendant due to her low blood pressure, but it was that very thing that prevented her heart from bursting on impact with the mountainside. Severe amnesia meant she never remembered anything from the crash, and she even continued to fly right up until her death in 2016.
Oh shit.
Ava
Is that Michael J.
Wisniewska.
Fox?
Paragliding doesn't appeal to everyone,
look good.
and
He
it
look
probably
good
won't
now.
be at the top of your bucket
he got
list after
Parkinson's.
hearing this
He's taking his
terrifying
stuff, doing
story. In February 2007, then 35-year-old Iwa Wisniewska was training for the upcoming paragliding world championships in Australia when the unthinkable
We're gonna
happened.
edit that out.
While passing beneath the storm cloud, Wisniewska was suddenly sucked into the violent storm above.
Yeah, gotta suck
At the
on her.
mercy of Mother Nature
Yeah, there you go,
herself,
bitch.
Wisniewska was whisked higher and higher into the air at top
suck
speeds
the
of
whole
20 meters per second
parachute.
as lightning flashed around her and she was pelted by hailstones the size of tennis balls.
Damn, bitch.
Suddenly, everything went black as Wisniewska lost consciousness and surrendered herself to the storm. At minus 40-degree temperatures, the vortex, raging at speeds of 50 miles per hour, took the defenseless woman to dizzying heights of 32,634 feet. For some
All
perspective, that's an altitude higher than Mount Everest's peak and near the cruising height of a jumbo jet.
call it the
After
Mount
about a
High
half hour,
Club in
Wisniewska
the
woke up
airport.
and managed to navigate herself out of the passing storm to a nearby farm, suffering only frostbite to her extremities. In case you were wondering just how lucky that makes her, Australia's most experienced paraglider, Godfrey Wennis, said Wisniewska's survival was like winning the lotto 10 times in a row. Caleb Whitby. The events that caused 27-year-old Caleb Whitby to end up in this death-defying situation sound like something from a Final Destination movie. Whitby was driving up an incline on an icy freeway in Oregon in January 2015 when a collision ahead kick-started a devastating 50-car pileup. Whitby initially swerved to avoid a jackknife truck, but as the thick fog cleared, he realized that the large rig he had been following was now sprawled across the freeway. Despite his best attempts to swerve around it, Whitby hit the back of the rig and was left sat on the roadside and at the mercy of the oncoming traffic. He could only brace himself and watch helplessly as a second rig spiraled out of control and started heading his way. Before he knew it, the ordeal was over and he was surrounded by shattered glass and mangled metal. Crushed between the two rigs in his Chevy Silverado, he realized he was unable to move, but was thankful to still be alive. Whitby shouted for help and was rescued by Sergei Karpulak, who drove the second truck in the crash. Miraculously, all he had to show for his brush with death were a few bruises and one killer photo.
Yo, that go viral on Instagram.
Anyone would be lucky to survive being attacked by a grizzly bear, but Todd Orr took good fortune to the next level after he survived 2 attacks on the same day. On September 30th, 2016, Orr was hiking through Madison Valley in rural Montana in search for elk when he stumbled across a grizzly bear and her cubs. Before he could register the danger he was in, the adult grizzly was charging towards him in a flurry of teeth and claws. Despite using bear spray as a deterrent, the animal jumped on top of him, biting his head and arms before wandering off into the woods. Orr struggled to his feet and managed to jog back to his car about 3 miles away. But before he could make his getaway, the bear emerged from behind for round 2. Being an enthusiastic outdoorsman, Orr knew that only one thing might spare him from death: convincing the bear that it had actually killed him. As the weight of the animal came down on top of him again, Orr threw himself face down and used his arms to protect his neck and head, praying for the end. After the bear left, Orr managed to drive himself to the hospital where he spent several hours in surgery, followed by 6 months of rehab. Heart in a spin. Doctors are constantly surprised by the things humans can survive, but they were truly baffled by this x-ray, which revealed how a man's heart had spun over the right side in his chest without killing him. The bizarre event occurred in 2014, when a 48-year-old Italian man was rushed to the hospital after a brutal motorcycle accident. Doctors at the emergency department made the discovery when they tried to monitor the man's heartbeat and realized it wasn't where it should be. An x-ray and CT scan of his chest revealed that his heart had turned a full 90 degrees to the right in a total anatomical anomaly. What's even more surprising is that, despite suffering punctured lungs, broken ribs, and a ruptured spleen, the man was alert and awake the entire time. At first, it seemed that the collision must have caused his body to twist so violently that it moved his heart. But doctors eventually determined it was due to his other injuries. Wounds to the man's lungs had caused air to leak and build up in his chest, eventually forcing his heart over to the other side. After draining the air, the man's heart rotated back to the left and eventually returned to its original position in 24 hours, making him one seriously lucky guy. Paul Rosoli. Some people like to tempt fate and then complain when they get more than they bargained for. Naturalist Paul Rosoli is one of those people. In 2014, he was swallowed by a giant anaconda. On purpose. It goes without saying that this is something you shouldn't try at home, or at all for that matter, and Rosoli learned the hard way that even a Discovery Channel documentary isn't worth sliding down an 18-foot snake's gullet for. In the TV special titled Eaten Alive, Rosoli donned a special snake-proof suit, lathered himself in pig's blood, and then acted like a predator to provoke the massive snake into attacking him. Once the anaconda started to engulf him, though, he quickly realized his mistake. As he heard his arms breaking under the immense pressure of the snake's jaw, Rosoli panicked and called on his team to free him. Thankfully, they were able to separate him from the snake before things got too out of hand, and both parties emerged unscathed. Or should I say scaled? Seriously though, what did he expect? Robert Evans. If you ever feel like you're having a bad day, spare a moment to think about Robert Evans, who suffered a truly unfortunate series of events over the span of just 7
His hairline
hours.
worse than
On the
mine.
evening of September 23, 2009, the 46-year-old homeless man was cycling at the intersection of Folsom Street and Canyon Boulevard in Boulder, Colorado, when he was hit by a car which made a swift getaway from the scene. Thankfully, Evans was taken to Boulder Community Hospital where he was treated for minor injuries. After being released at 3 a.m. the following morning, Evans began the 4 to 5 mile trek back to a campsite he was using in East Boulder. At around 4:45 a.m.,
got
he
hit
decided
again.
to take a shortcut by crossing a narrow railroad bridge between Pearl Parkway and Valmont Road. Unfortunately, Evans' timing was far from perfect, and he was struck by an empty Burlington Northern Santa Fe coal train, which knocked him and his bike into a creek 10 feet below. After sustaining non-life-threatening injuries to his head and leg, Evans was left feeling incredibly lucky. I just hope he bought a lottery ticket afterwards. Stephen McCormack. It's safe to say New Zealander Steve McCormack can enjoy a newly inflated ego after his lucky escape from death. Back in 2011, this small-town truck driver was standing on the rigging between his truck and a trailer at Waiatahi Contractors when one slip sparked an unbelievable chain of events. After losing his footing, McCormack fell onto a brass valve that was connecting the truck's brakes to the compressed air supply. The valve pierced his left buttock, and within seconds, air rushed
up
into
his
his
ass?
body at a rate of 100 pounds per square inch. His shell-shocked co-workers watched as McCormack's body inflated to twice its size, turning him into a human Michelin
Hell
man.
no.
Obviously, no footage of the event exists, but all I can imagine is the scene was similar to this movie clip.
Oh boy.
As the air continued to pump and McCormack screamed in agony, the men struggled to lift him off the nozzle and managed to place him on his side until paramedics arrived an hour later. The air had separated fat from muscle and filled the space between, including his abdomen and chest, as well as the space around his heart, lungs, and even behind his eyelids. When paramedics tried to insert a needle for a morphine drip, the air pressure only forced it back out. If the valve had hit an artery, he likely would have bled to death, so his backside actually saved his life. In the end, there was only one thing to do: wait for him to deflate naturally via one epic case of flatulence. A hot Israfil. There are some things that humans aren't really built to endure, and having half of your brain blown off is probably one of them. Still, one exceptionally lucky man proved that some people are more robust than we think after he survived such an ordeal at just the age of 14. Back in 1987, a hot Israfil was working at his local convenience store in Dayton, Ohio when one small mishap turned his entire life upside down.
What'd he do?
Israfil's employer was handling one of the dangerous firearms in the store when he accidentally dropped it, causing it to misfire in the direction of the young store clerk.
Really?
Despite the severity of his injuries, Israfil survived the journey to the hospital and underwent a 5-hour operation. Most of his right hemisphere and one half of his skull had been totally destroyed, causing his scalp to collapse inward after the underlying tissue was removed. When he regained consciousness, doctors were surprised to find that Israfil was already attempting to speak. Eventually, doctors filled the missing portion of Israfil's head with a hard silicone implant. Sadly, in 2019, Israfil passed away aged 47. But he had already exceeded expectations by living a normal life and even graduating from his local university. Forthman Murph. Mississippi lumberjack Forthman Murph had been chopping down trees his whole life, so it's no surprise that he was still doing it in the summer of 1984 at the ripe old age of 74. That is, until one fateful afternoon when Murph's beloved hobby almost killed him. While trimming trees in the Gatman area, a branch fell from 80 feet above and knocked him unconscious into a ditch, while a second broke his left leg and foot. When Murph came back around, he could hear the buzzing of his still-running chainsaw, which had started making its way across his neck. Most people would tap out at this point, but not Murph. He managed to stand up and hobble to his truck 150 feet away, stopping periodically to bend down and ensure his windpipe didn't fill with his own blood. Holding his head precariously in place, Murph then drove to a neighbor's house who took him 17 miles to a small-town hospital. From there, he was rushed another 30 miles to a bigger hospital to have his head quite literally reattached. Surprisingly, Murph went on to live to 92 years old, dedicating his last days to his three loves: music, Jesus Christ, and chainsaws. Maybe he should have just laid off that last one though. Number 10. Natalia Pasternak. One summer's afternoon in June 2015, 55-year-old Natalia Pasternak and her 80-year-old friend Valentina Gorodetskaya were walking through the Siberian forest collecting birch saps, unaware that this was a trip they might never have returned from. The pair had unknowingly crossed into the path of a huge brown bear, which made an initial beeline for Valentina's dog, before turning its attention to the mother of two, Natalia. After attempting to separate the wild animal from her friend by hitting it with a stick, Valentina ran to find help, leaving Natalia to face the jaws of death. During the hour-long ordeal, the bear assumed that its now mauled prey was finally dead and began burying Natalia with earth and leaves in order to eat her later. Eventually, police arrived on the scene and noticed that the part-exposed woman was still breathing, and with no other options, they shot the bear and unearthed Natalia, who later fully recovered in hospital. Despite being buried alive and intended as a brown bear's next meal, Natalia Pasternak lived to tell the terrifying tale and even posted an update on her social media with the caption, "Life is beautiful." Number 9.
Oh, I bet.
Phineas Gage. The case of Phineas Gage is quite literally mind-blowing. On September 13th, 1848, then 25-year-old Gage was working as the foreman of a crew preparing a railroad near Cavendish, Vermont, when disaster struck. He was using an iron tamping rod to pack explosive powder into a hole when the powder suddenly detonated, sending the 43-inch long, 1.25-inch diameter rod hurtling upward. The rod penetrated Gage's left cheek, tearing through his brain and exiting through the back of his skull, where it landed 80 feet away. Remarkably, Gage was able to walk to a nearby cart to alert a co-worker, who rushed him to a doctor, where the physician was astonished to find his patient conscious and able to communicate. Despite losing sight in his left eye, Gage was able to leave his house within a month and could even recount exactly when and how the accident happened. But it wasn't long until those closest to him noticed something wrong. His well-mannered disposition had been replaced by an unheard-of aggression and lack of social decorum, and family and friends claimed he was no longer himself. Studies carried out in 2012 concluded that the injury had destroyed around 11% of white matter in Gage's frontal lobe and 4% of his cerebral cortex, causing irreversible damage to his rational processing. To this day, Gage is remembered as one of the most famous patients in neuroscience. Number 8. Casey Wagner. They say lightning never strikes twice, but one man learned the hard way that famous phrases shouldn't always be taken as fact. In October 2013, 31-year-old Casey Wagner was attending an annual off-road event in St. Joe, Texas called Rednecks with Paychecks when storm clouds began rolling in above. While waiting for a friend to return from the toilet, Wagner sought shelter under a tree. A mistake which would cost him dearly. By the time he noticed electrical sparks splintering off the tree trunk, it was already too late. Casey was suddenly struck by lightning, and before he could hit the ground, a second bolt struck his work boot, sending electricity shooting up through his body. Luckily, a passing nurse rushed to his aid and kept him conscious while they waited for paramedics to arrive at the scene. Astonishingly, after just one night in observation, Casey was released with no major injuries, and doctors claimed he was a living miracle. The chances of being struck by lightning in the US are around 1 in 750,000, so Casey Wagner was incredibly lucky to survive a double strike. One thing is for sure though, he won't be standing under any more trees during bad weather.
Yeah, I hope not.
Number 7. Sambora. In August 2018, one man beat all odds by surviving 4 days in the Cambodian jungle with no food, water, or means of escape. Oh, and did I mention he was wedged between two giant rocks? 28-year-old Sambora had been scouring the Chakri mountain jungle in the northwestern province of Battenberg in search of bad droppings or guano to sell as valuable fertilizer when his torch fell into a small rocky hollow. Bending down to retrieve it, Boris slipped and fell into the narrow crevice between the rocky terrain below, where he became wedged in the rock face for 4 agonizing days.
Hell no.
Eventually, his worried brother discovered him and alerted the authorities, who took this unbelievable photo from above before beginning a painstaking operation to free the man. It took 200 rescuers around 10 hours to cut away the parts of the rock which had trapped him, before he was taken to a provincial hospital to recover. The Cambodian police chief has since declared Chakrai Mountain prohibited for climbing, and despite being dangerously weak shortly after the ordeal, Sambora has thankfully returned to full health, making him one impossibly lucky man. Number 6. Christine McKenzie. Skydiving is a thrill for some, but but for many others, the idea of falling through the sky is a total nightmare.
Yeah.
Even when there's a parachute involved.
Yep.
When then 23-year-old Christine McKenzie prepared for her 112th skydive in August 2004, she had no idea that it would be any different from her other successful attempts. As a seasoned skydiver, McKenzie was unfazed as she began her 11,000-foot descent until it was time to prepare for landing and her parachute failed to open. Trying not to panic, she pulled on the cord of her emergency chute, but the lines got tangled and she hurtled towards the ground in a 45-second freefall before smashing into a set of power cables. By absorbing most of the energy from her fall, the power lines had saved McKenzie's life. And when she was admitted to hospital, she suffered only a broken pelvis. Skydiving instructor Vanna Gulliver was astounded to find her alive and claimed that a reserve parachute malfunction is basically unheard of. Despite her ordeal, McKenzie even announced from her hospital bed she was determined to jump again. Number 5. Greg Rasmussen. Greg Rasmussen is an animal conservationist who came a little too close for comfort with some of the fiercest predators in the African bush back in 2003. Rasmussen had boarded his single-engine plane over Hawaiian National Park in Zimbabwe in search of endangered rhinos when he lost control during intense winds and crashed into the plains below. After quickly realizing that he'd broken both legs, Rasmussen was able to drag himself to a nearby tree to seek shelter. But his nightmare was far from over. The impact had detuned his radio, so any mayday calls went unheard, and he soon realized he would have to wait it out in the wilderness. Vulnerable and exposed, Rasmussen became an easy and appealing meal for nearby predators, and as vultures began to circle, a stampede of elephants headed towards the wreckage. Thinking fast, Rasmussen beat the aluminum hull of his aircraft with a stick, which scared them off, and he repeated the same trick after identifying the chilling call of a lioness as dusk set in. After surviving the night and fending off a hungry hyena with his drumming, Rasmussen was found and rescued. And after some 100 operations, some use of his legs was restored, and he is now 3 inches shorter. Number 4. Truman Duncan.
Twins.
Becoming known as the Miracle Man is no easy feat, but 40-year-old Truman Duncan definitely deserves such a title after surviving being cut clean in half. In June 2006, Truman was working at Greenbrier Rail Service in Claiborne, Texas, when he fell between a pair of moving railroad freight cars and found himself fighting for his life. After hanging onto the car for 20 seconds, Truman was caught beneath the wheel supporting 20,000 pounds of dead weight, which dragged him along for 50 feet before severing him through the pelvis bone. Miraculously, Truman stayed conscious and even contacted 911 before waiting 45 minutes for paramedics to locate him at the huge rail yard. Blood loss had sent his body into crucial preservation mode, and his vital organs like his heart, lungs, liver, and 1 kidney remained intact. After 23 surgeries over 4 months, Truman, who now uses a wheelchair, was fully active again, and he has even returned to work in the office at the very same rail yard. Number 3. Anna Bagenholm. In 1999, Swedish orthopedic surgeon Anna Bagenholm made medical history when she was shockingly revived after freezing to death some 24 hours earlier. Then 29-year-old Bagenholm had been skiing with colleagues in the Kjolund mountain range in Norway when she lost control during a steep descent and fell onto a frozen stream below. A hole then opened up beneath her body, swallowing her head first and trapping her under 8 inches of ice with no means of escape. And when her friends found her and attempted to pull her out, only her feet and skis were above the ice. After 40 minutes of shallow breathing using a tiny air pocket, Anna's body temperature reached a staggeringly low 13.70 degrees Celsius, and she entered circulatory arrest. By the time rescuers dug her out, she had been under the freezing ice for 80 minutes, and when she was airlifted to hospital, she had undoubtedly been clinically dead for 2 hours. After desperate efforts to rewarm her blood, Anna's heart miraculously restarted 24 hours after her initial fall, and after more than a year, she was able to move again. Doctors believe that the extreme cold slowed her metabolism, causing the brain to require less oxygen, and induced hypothermia is now practiced with critical patients to prolong the window needed to save lives. Number 2. Ron Hunt. It may seem unlikely that the subject of an X-ray like this one could make it out alive, but one incredibly lucky man has lived to tell the tale. On 15th August 2003, construction worker Ron Hunt was working in the Tahoe Donner subdivision in Truckee, California, when one mishap almost cost him his life. Hunt was drilling above his head while standing on a 6-foot ladder when he pushed a little too hard, trying to bore a hole, causing the ladder to wobble. Realizing what was about to happen, Hunt followed standard safety procedure by tossing the drill aside, but the power tool didn't fall far enough away, and he landed face first on the 18-inch long, 1.5-inch diameter drill bit. The tool skewered his head by entering his right eye and exiting about 6 inches through the side of his skull, but it miraculously pushed his brain aside, sparing him from brain damage, paralysis, and probable death. Specialists initially planned to cut the drill bit out, but decided to effectively unscrew it free, and Hunt recovered from his injuries in just under a month. Despite losing an eye and suffering a fractured skull, Hunt emerged relatively unscathed, and his cognitive health has proved even more remarkable than the curious case of Phineas Gage. Before I continue, check out this incredible footage captured on helmet cam, which shows the moment motorcyclist Taylor Smith flipped in the air and somehow landed on his feet after being hit by a speeding car on his way home from work. The extraordinary event took place in San Francisco in 2015 when the car emerged from nowhere after running a red light at an intersection and hit Mr. Smith side on. The 2011 Daytona 675 custom bike was destroyed in an instant, but thankfully Smith himself was wearing all the correct protective gear. Smith only suffered minor bruising and was astonished to find himself on his feet, having probably also saved the lives of the pedestrians crossing at the right side of the street. Number 1. Lucky log escape. If you've ever seen Final Destination 2, you'll remember this terrifying scene. But your fear of freak logging truck related catastrophes may not be so irrational after seeing this photo. In October 2019, one motorist in Georgia had an incredibly lucky escape after his 2003 Nissan Xterra was impaled by logs from front to back. The unnamed driver was bending down to collect a dropped coffee cup when he rear-ended a logging truck in front, which sent as many as 40 felled trees smashing through the windshield and out the other end. The scene may look like a definite death trap, but thankfully the driver emerged with only minor injuries because his seat was not in an upright position at the time of impact. Firefighters cut through the massive logs before rescuing the man in around 10 to 15 minutes, and the chief officer was astounded to discover that his head had ended up in a hole perfectly sized to protect him from the logs. This person needs to buy a lottery ticket with that sort of luck.
That's real.
Danny Balch. If you're looking for danger, camping out next to an active volcano is one surefire way to find it. Back in 1980, Danny J. Balch and his friend Brian Thomas were camping in a meadow near Mount St. Helens when they were jolted awake at 8:32 a.m. by an intense rumbling sound. When the pair looked out of the tent window, their worst fears were confirmed. An eruption was heading their way. As they dashed for the tree line, Balch was hit by a blast of heat and a shower of ash, mud, and ice that caked him in grit and pushed him flat to the ground. In those few seconds, his entire body went from frozen to baked as the extreme heat melted the skin off his fingers. When he came to, Balch called out for Thomas and managed to wade into the river to soothe his burns. As he resumed his search and began scrambling through fallen trees, he suddenly felt a hand on his left shoulder that took him by surprise. When he looked down, he was shocked to see Thomas under a tangle of tree limbs. Thomas had a broken hip, but Balch was able to pull him up just before the cloud of ash plunged the sky into darkness so that neither man could see just inches in front of them. Miraculously, two other campers in the group, Bruce Nelson and Sue Ruff, who had been toasting marshmallows at the time of the explosion, saw the two men and helped carry Thomas to the ruins of an old cabin where they built a makeshift lean-to. Balch then set off with the others to find rescue, and they were eventually spotted at about 6 p.m. by two helicopters. But he didn't forget about Thomas. Balch used a map to show them where his friend was, and the men were airlifted to the hospital to recover. The worst part is that Balch had wanted to go to the beach that day, but was convinced by Thomas to go camping at the volcano. Never give in to peer pressure, guys. Helen Claiborne. The year was 1963, and then 21-year-old Helen Claiborne was on the hunt for adventure. She'd left her hometown of Brooklyn to head for Hong Kong or India, but she had to reach San Francisco first, which meant getting on a flight to Whitehorse, the capital of the Yukon Territory. Claiborne was on a budget, so she decided to fly with an amateur pilot, 41-year-old Ralph Flores, in his single-engine plane instead. What could go wrong? The pair set off on February 4th, 1963, but not long into the journey, Flores ran into a snowstorm and tried to take the plane above the clouds. When he descended, he hoped to follow landmarks or the path of the Alaska Highway to reach Fort St. John, but instead he was met with mountains and trees. Before Claiborne could understand what was going on, the plane crashed into a desolate stretch of wilderness near the Yukon-British Columbia border. The pair miraculously survived. Claiborne suffered a broken left arm and Flores a fractured jaw. But they were now stranded in sub-zero temperatures as low as negative 42 degrees Celsius.
Damn.
The little food they had on board, a few cans of sardines, tuna, fruit salad, a box of saltine crackers, and some vitamin pills, were rationed within 10 days, forcing them to make soup from melted snow. The pair were able to create a shelter from a piece of tarpaulin and cushions from the plane, while they also fashioned a blanket from the plane's carpet and used gasoline from the fuel tank to light a campfire that would keep them warm at night. Eventually, Flores found a frozen pond and etched an enormous SOS sign with an arrow pointing to their campsite. On day 49 of their ordeal, Charles Hamilton, a pilot flying supplies to a nearby trapper's cabin, spotted the SOS and rescued them. Claiborne passed away in 2018, age 76, but the story of her amazing survival will continue to live on in her 1964 book, Hey, I'm Alive. Man, all this talk of danger is enough to make you grateful for your own safety. How many of you are watching this video from the comfort of your bed right now? Why not give this video a like and subscribe so I know there are thrill seekers out there who love binging this kind of heart-pumping stuff while shoveling down on cheese balls at home. Julianne Copy. If you have a fear of flying, you might want to cover your ears for this one. On Christmas Eve, 1971, then 17-year-old Julianne Copy was flying over the Peruvian rainforest on Lanza Flight 508 with her mother when things took a turn for the worst. The plane flew into a dark, violent storm which shook the entire cabin before all the lights cut out and the aircraft went into a total nosedive. Copy closed her eyes tightly and covered her ears to drown out the noise of passengers screaming and the deep roar of the engines. But suddenly, it all stopped. The plane had disintegrated about 2 miles above the ground, and she was now in free fall, still strapped to her seat. As the canopy of the jungle spun towards her, Copy blacked out just before impact. The next day, she awoke in the rainforest and realized she was totally alone. She was the sole survivor of the crash, but her ordeal still wasn't over yet. She had a broken collarbone and some deep cuts on her legs, but Copy was able to walk until she found a stream to follow. After being alone in the wilderness for 10 days, Copy found a small path to a hut with a palm roof. Nearby was an outboard motor from a large boat and a liter of gasoline, which she used to treat a maggot-infested wound on her right arm. After spending the night there, Copy was awoken to the voices of men outside, who initially thought she was a water goddess from local legend. After explaining her ordeal in Spanish, the men treated her wounds and took her back to civilization where she was reunited with her father. Copy told her amazing story in the 2000 documentary Wings of Hope by director Werner Herzog, who coincidentally had a seat booked on that very flight before canceling last minute.
Danny Pienaar. In 1998, Danny Pienaar was a research student studying the habits of white rhinos in the Pa-Beni tributary in South Africa. But this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity almost ended in tragedy. On one Thursday afternoon that January, Pienaar decided to head out on a tracking expedition without telling his campmates where he was going. As he waded through the waters of a small stream, Pienaar saw something long and brown slithering in the nearby reeds. The next thing he knew, Pienaar felt a burning sensation on one side of his leg, just under the knee. After looking down and finding 4 bluish-purple holes and a drop of blood, his worst suspicions were confirmed. He'd just been bitten by a black mamba snake. Black mamba venom is notoriously fast-acting, as it shuts down the nervous system and paralyzes victims, and without antivenom, its fatality rate is 100%. Pienaar knew now that his only chance of survival was to make it back to his car and attempt the long trek back to the main town. Despite tying a tourniquet around his leg, the venom was already taking over his body as tunnel vision set in and his heartbeat sped up. After feverishly making his way back through the wilderness, Pienaar reached his car and drove over 100 miles per hour down the road until he saw another car and forced them to stop. By the time they reached the hospital in Nelspruit, over 2 hours after he was bitten, Pienaar could no longer swallow or speak as paralysis set in. After several days on a ventilator, Pienaar was released with nothing but the bite marks and one awesome story to tell.
Poon
Damn.
Lim. When Chinese native Poon Lim took a job as a steward on a British ship named the SS Ben
Poon
Lomond,
Lim?
which was traveling from Cape Town to Suriname during World War II, he probably never imagined that it'd earn him a world record for the longest time spent adrift at sea. In 1942, a German U-boat came across the SS Ben Lomond 750 miles east of the Amazon, and a pair of torpedoes sank it in 2 minutes flat. It happened so fast that most of the crew on board sunk with the vessel. Of the total 55 crew members, Poon Lim would be the only survivor. As the ship sank, Lim managed to grab a life jacket and jump overboard just before the boilers exploded. After drifting aimlessly for about 2 hours, Lim spotted an 8x8 foot raft and hauled himself onto it. The raft contained some meager survival rations, including tins of dried biscuits, 40 liters of water, a bag of sugar cubes, chocolate, an electric torch, and a handful of flares.
Damn.
But the food didn't last long, and Lim had to improvise by taking the wire from the flashlight and making a fish hook, which he fixed to the end of some hemp rope as a makeshift line. He also fashioned a knife out of the biscuit tin, which he used to kill seabirds, and then used the bird meat to catch sharks. As if that wasn't badass enough, Lim did all this without ever learning how to swim properly. In fact, he tied himself to the raft with rope to make sure he never fell off. Poon Lim spent a grand total of 133 days at sea until 3 Brazilian fishermen spotted his raft on the 5th of April 1943 and rescued him. He'd lost nearly 20 pounds in weight, but was crucially alive. When Poon Lim was asked what he thought of his world record, he simply said, "I hope no one will have to break it." Imagine going through an ordeal like that and still having a sense of humor about it. Do any of you guys have any crazy survival stories to tell?
Yes.
Maybe a relative or a friend of yours had a run-in with fate that needs to be shared with the world. Chris Gursky. If you're an adrenaline junkie, hang gliding might be your thing, but you might want to think twice after seeing this.
Yeah, fuck him up. Oh shit. Yo, he riding too loose. Don't grab my inner thigh, bitch. I'd have kicked him off. Get off me, bitch.
The man you see here clinging desperately to prevent himself from plummeting to his death is Florida Auto Parts manager and photographer Chris Gursky.
Nope.
Back in 2018, Gursky was vacationing in Switzerland when he decided to give hang gliding a go for the first time.
Nope.
Little did he know
He
it
wouldn't
was
have made
almost
it.
the last thing he'd get to do.
See,
Gursky's instructor forgot one crucial thing: hooking Gursky onto the glider. After taking off from a
really
4,000-foot mountain ledge, Gursky had to hang on for an agonizing 2 minutes and 14 seconds as the pilot desperately tried to steer with one hand to get him safely to the ground. Thankfully, the pair were able to make a safe landing, and Gursky walked away with a torn left bicep tendon from hanging on and a fractured wrist from the force of the impact when he hit the floor.
Damn.
After uploading the jaw-dropping footage of his ordeal online, Gursky said he wasn't angry at the instructor and would even give hang gliding another go. That's one seriously brave dude.
No, I'm not that brave.
Kutu Shaw.
I'm not that brave.
Animal attacks are no laughing matter.
I'm not that brave.
And
Oh.
if there's one creature you don't want to face off against, it's a 400-pound polar bear.
In armor?
Just ask Kutu Shaw. In September
fight no
2003,
400-pound
46-year-old
bear?
Shaw was working as a guide on a hunting trip
In
in
armor?
Peru, Canada, when things
How did
took
it
a
get
grisly
armor?
turn. In the early hours of
It
the
must have
morning,
been like a
Shaw and
Russian
the
bear,
captain
a
of the
Russian polar
Nuyukulik
bear.
Hunters and Trappers organization awoke to find that the ceiling of their tent had been shredded as they slept.
shit
At
it
first,
on.
it looked like the tent had been filled with snow, but as their bleary eyes adjusted, they realized it wasn't snow. It was the white fur of the perpetrator, which was now looming over the men.
Oh, that
The
nigga-
captain immediately started running, and after failing to find a knife in the tent, Shaw joined him.
No,
But the
run,
fearsome
bitch.
polar bear was hot on
Run,
their
ho.
heels. Shaw was about 4 paces behind the captain, but then the unthinkable happened.
Because when it really goes down, I don't have to outrun the polar bear or whatever's chasing us. I just gotta outrun yo, hopefully fat ass. And that's why it's good not to discriminate on the size of people you take with you on camping trips. If somebody's gotta go and you gotta lighten your camping load, it might as well be the big people. What? It's not gonna be me. I literally can't let it be me. Those are the rules.
He tripped on a small
Yep,
rock,
there
and
it
before
is.
he knew it, the 400-pound beast came down
Right
on
in
top
his
of him.
ass.
The polar
Yep.
bear dragged Shaw towards
Damn.
the ocean, then gouged its claws into his back and sunk its ginormous teeth into his head.
Oh.
Just when it looked like it was game over for Shaw, the group's cook grabbed a gun that belonged to one of the American sport hunters and shot the bear twice, killing the animal. Amazingly, Shaw never lost consciousness.
Damn.
When they finally reached the ER, 3 handfuls of sand were removed from the blood-clotted area around his skull, which may have saved his life by slowing down the bleeding. After 13 hours of intensive surgery, Shaw walked free with a new nickname in Kimmeroot, the Polar Bear Man.
Oh boy.
Chris Lemons.
Nope.
In September
Not
2012,
doing none of that.
Edinburgh-born saturation diver Chris Lemons was working in the North Sea, diving from his ship, the Bibby Topaz, and a diving bell to repair oil rig structures. One fateful day, Chris was lowered 91 meters in a diving bell alongside colleagues Dave Yusa and Duncan Alcock to fix a pipe on the seabed at the Huntington oil
Alcock.
field east of Peterhead and Aberdeenshire. But this was almost one trip he didn't return from. During the repair, Chris heard an alarm sounding in dive control, which meant getting out of the structure and back to the diving bell as quickly as possible. What the men didn't know was that the ship was moving away thanks to a failure in the computer which kept it in position. Then disaster struck. Lemons' umbilical cable became snagged on part of the metal structure. This not only tethers divers back to the diving bell and the ship, but also provides them with breathing gas, hot water to keep their suits warm, as well as light and electricity.
Oh no!
With the 8,000-ton boat pulling in the opposite direction, and Lemons basically acting as a human anchor, there was only one outcome. The umbilical cable snapped, plunging him 100 meters down towards the seabed.
Oh,
Without it, Chris
yeah.
only had about 5 minutes of emergency gas stored in a set of normal diving cylinders on his back. He managed to find the structure they'd been working on and climbed on top of it, but the diving bell wasn't there, and he'd already used up about 2 to 3 minutes of gas. The clock was ticking, and Chris accepted his fate and blacked out. His colleagues put in a superhuman effort to locate him, but they were expecting to find a body, which is exactly what they thought when they found Chris laying on the floor of the rig. But after being hauled onto the diving bell and given 2 breaths, Lemons sputtered to life, 35 minutes after he had turned on his emergency supply of air.
What?
With nothing to breathe for that long, Chris could have easily suffered brain damage, but the gas they breathe has a high concentration of oxygen, which saturated his tissues and cells to allow him to survive. In just 3 weeks, this extremely lucky guy was even back working with his team again.
No! No.
Coolidge Winsett. Popping to the toilet to drop off some timber probably isn't at the top of your list of potentially life-threatening situations. But you can never be too safe. Just ask Coolidge Winsett. Winsett is a 75-year-old retired janitor and World War II veteran who lives in the very same home he grew up in Southwest Virginia. The problem is the property hadn't changed much over the years and there was no indoor bathroom. Just a rickety old outhouse Winsett had built himself back in 1950. That didn't
Motherfucker,
bother
what?
old Winsett. He'd been using it for years, and he didn't think twice about paying it a visit one hot afternoon in August 2000. But while Winsett sat minding his own business, literally, the rotting floorboards below finally gave way,
Oh my
dumping the
God.
retired veteran into the filthy pit below. Luckily for him, he was able to stay afloat after landing on the remains of the floorboards, which acted like a makeshift raft. Unfortunately, Winsett had already been partially paralyzed by a stroke and was missing part of one leg, leaving him well and truly stuck. As
Oh
time
boy.
ticked by, the 17-year-old mailman, the only regular visitor to Winsett's property, noticed that the mail had started piling up, so he decided to investigate. Luckily, he discovered Winsett after following his weakened cries, and the old man was rescued by the fire department after 3 whole days in the pit. Now that's one seriously crappy ordeal.
Oh, hell no.
The Robertson family. On the 27th of January 1971, the Robertson family from the village of Merebrook in Staffordshire, UK, set off from Falmouth, Cornwall, on a voyage to parts unknown. Retired merchant naval officer Dougal Robertson had purchased a 43-foot wooden schooner called Lucette, which would be perfect for the educational adventure he had planned for his wife Lynn, 18-year-old son Douglas, 17-year-old daughter Anne, and twin sons Neil and Sandy, both 9. Over the next year and a half, the family sailed across the Atlantic, stopping at different Caribbean ports and taking in amazing sights all over the world. But on the 15th of June 1972, the family encountered a pod of killer whales near the Galapagos Islands, which launched an attack, damaging the boat beyond repair. The family, plus a student hitchhiker they'd picked up named Robin Williams, managed to scramble on board an inflatable lifeboat and dinghy. Once
Run,
stranded,
Robin
the
Williams,
group got by
run!
for 6 days on a few rations like biscuits, dried bread, onions, and fruits. But they eventually resorted to hunting turtles to eat and collecting rainwater to drink. After 16 days, the inflatable raft became unusable, so the 6 people crammed onto the 10-foot-long dinghy called the Edna Mare, taking it in turns to sit in the dry part of the boat. Finally, on the 23rd of July 1972, 38 days into their trip on the Edna Mare, they were picked up after a Japanese fishing trawler named the Tokomaru II spotted their distress fire. Next time you fancy some family bonding time, just stick to the Scrabble.
Nigger.
Rui Mahamatsu. As far as car accidents go, this one has got to be something straight out of a nightmare.
What?
This spine-chilling photograph was taken in March 2014 after football player Rui Mahamatsu, who plays for Johannesburg's Orlando Pirates, had a narrow brush with death on the highway. Mahamatsu had been driving his BMW 3 Series when the car slipped on a wet patch of road, causing him to lose control. Before he knew it, the entire vehicle was impaled by a guardrail that pierced the windscreen and exited through the back, all while miraculously missing the driver himself. Onlookers were shocked to see Mr. Mahamatsu walk away from the accident without a single scratch on him.
What?
Someone up above must really have been looking out for him that day. And if that wasn't quite Final Destination enough for you, take a look at this total nail-biter. It's hard to imagine surviving something like this, but one lucky motorist in Western China is living proof that it can be done. In 2015, the unnamed man was driving to Chongqing when he heard a loud bang come from the opposite lane. Before he had time to process what was happening, he spotted a huge circular blade bouncing through the bushes of the central reservation, which then smashed into the front of his vehicle. Highway police said a truck had crashed in the opposite lane and the saw blade had been thrown off and into the road. The driver may have escaped unharmed, but this 50-centimeter gouge is one scratch that isn't going to come off too
scary as
easily.
hell.
Margaret Guire. Margaret Guire was a British national from the city of Saskatoon in Saskatchewan, Canada. She was just 26 years old when she married Reverend Herbert Guire on the 15th of April, 1915. Less than a month later, the pair boarded the RMS Lusitania in New York, bound for Liverpool. But little did she know Margaret was about to star in one of the most bizarre survival stories of all time. On May 7th, just 6 days after leaving the port, the Grand Ocean liner was torpedoed by a German submarine while Margaret and Herbert were at dinner. Not long after the impact, the lights went out and mass panic set in as the boat began listing badly to starboard. Herbert escorted Margaret to a lifeboat and helped her in along with 3 other women and a baby. But what Herbert didn't realize was that, as Margaret looked up, she thought the ship's smokestacks were going to fall on the lifeboat and quickly clambered back on deck. Meanwhile, Herbert hopped into another boat and began to row away. But when the deck Margaret was standing on slipped beneath the water, she desperately tried to swim away from the quickly sinking ship. Unfortunately, she didn't make it very far until she was sucked into a violent whirlpool and down into the funnel of one of the smokestacks along with 2 other men.
Damn.
This should have spelled the end for Margaret, but Lady Luck had other ideas. By some miracle, an explosion in the boiler room directly below the smokestack blew Margaret right out of the funnel and back to the surface. Margaret was rescued by a nearby lifeboat and quickly spotted her husband, who was sobbing over her loss on another boat nearby. At first, he didn't even recognize Margaret because she was so covered in soot.
She's black.
When the pair were reunited at last, Margaret composed herself and said, "Never mind, we've lost those awful wedding presents." She must have been some woman to still have a sense of humor after being fired out of a sinking ship. Beck Weathers. Climbing Mount Everest is a notoriously tricky feat. Thousands of successful mountaineers have reached its towering peak of 29,029 feet, but more than 300 others have lost their lives while trying. Even when using bottled oxygen, mountaineers can experience fatigue, nausea, vomiting, and other problems like hypothermia and frostbite during the climb. Back in 1996, 49-year-old Beck Weathers, a pathologist from Texas armed with all the confidence of a midlife crisis, decided he would take on the challenge. On May 10th, he and his team were due to summit the mountain when Weathers started losing his vision at around 28,000 feet. See, he had undergone a corneal operation not long before attempting the climb, and the high altitude had rendered him half blind. The guide decided to continue the group's ascent, promising to come back for Weathers on the way down. Although passing climbers offered to help him back, Weathers refused and decided to wait. Did I mention that this area is grimly known as the Death Zone? Because it's littered with the frozen, mummified bodies of other failed climbers? After some time, the wind picked up and a dangerous blizzard rolled in, dropping the temperatures to an unfathomable 90 degrees below zero. Weathers then decided to begin the climb back alone, but got bogged down in the storm. By the time help arrived, it was too late. He was deranged with hypothermia and lack of oxygen, and his right arm was frozen solid. At this point, the guide made the difficult decision to leave Weathers behind. The next day, doctors came to examine him. They chipped ice from his face and broke the news that he was just another casualty of the infamous death zone. But in a Hollywood-style twist, he later awoke from his coma. Finding himself covered in snow, he stood up and walked back in the direction of camp. When he arrived, it's safe to assume the other climbers probably mistook him for one of the White Walkers from Game of Thrones. Weathers was airlifted and taken to Kathmandu, where he lost his right arm from the elbow down, as well as his nose. Despite his ordeal, Weathers recovered fully and went on to become a motivational speaker. Hopefully, he also went on to take on a far less deadly hobby than mountain climbing, like cross-stitch or something. Joe Simpson. This tale of two British climbers sounds like the stuff of folklore, so it's no surprise it was turned into a best-selling book, a documentary, and a UK theater show titled Touching the Void. In spring 1985, 25-year-old Joe Simpson and 21-year-old Simon Yates became the first people to scale the west face of the Sula Grande mountain in the Peruvian Andes, which is almost 21,000 feet high, FYI. But what should have been a moment of total celebration quickly turned to one of terror, and very nearly tragedy. While the pair were making their descent, Simpson plunged down an ice cliff, breaking his right leg. As night fell and with a storm rapidly closing in, the two men were forced to continue in the dark with no way of communicating and almost 150 feet of rope separating them. While battling blizzards, avalanches, and frostbite, Yates chose to try and lower Simpson down the mountain by rope 300 agonizing feet at a time. He had already lowered him some 3,000 feet over an icy precipice when the snow seat he was using for leverage started to collapse. Suddenly, Yates was faced with an impossible decision. He couldn't see or hear Simpson, but he knew they were both as good as dead if he continued to hold on. So Yates took a knife and cut the rope, sending his climbing companion plunging to an early grave. Or so he thought. You see, Simpson had already fallen 100 feet into a cavern of snow and ice below. He was sure he was done for, but he somehow managed to muster the strength to crawl an immense journey of 6 miles to make his way back to base camp. 3 days later, Simpson arrived just in time to be reunited with Yates, who was just packing up to leave. Even more remarkably, Simpson showed no bitterness towards Yates, and has even said in the years since that he is sure he would have made the same decision if the roles were reversed. What a class act. The million-dollar question is, would you cut the rope to save yourself if it meant sacrificing a friend? Let me know how you think you deal with such a moral dilemma down in the comments below. I'm genuinely curious. Now, where were we? Angela Hernandez. This story sounds like one of those nightmares you have when your body jolts you awake with full-fledged terror and you can't ever go back to sleep. It all started on July 6, 2018, when Angela Hernandez was driving her white 2011 Jeep through the Big Sur area on her way to Southern California. Suddenly, Hernandez spotted a small animal in the road ahead and swerved to miss it. But this act of compassion would cost her big time. Hernandez's car veered off the edge of a cliff, plummeting 200 feet below to where the ocean meets a rocky beach that is completely isolated from the road above. When Angela next opened her eyes, she was still inside her car and she could feel water rising over her knees. Although every bone in her body hurt, she was able to remove her seatbelt and use a multi-tool she kept by her seat to smash the driver's side window. Then she jumped into the water and swam until she reached the shore, where she blacked out again. When she next woke up, it was still daylight. As she surveyed her surroundings, Hernandez saw nothing but rocks, the ocean, the sheer cliff above her, and her car, now half washed up on the shore and the roof ripped off. She had no shoes, and her jeans were ripped to shreds. As her grim reality became apparent, Hernandez scoured the shore, sunburned, dehydrated, and screaming for help, but no one on the road could hear her. Up above, the authorities were searching for Hernandez, who had been reported missing while traveling from Oregon to California.
Damn, she cute too.
But it would be 7 whole days until her ordeal was over. During that time, Hernandez used a hose from her car to catch water dripping from moss on rocks. But when Chad and Chelsea Moore spotted a discarded car bumper and followed the trail of debris to find the rest of the wrecked vehicle, they knew something was up. When the couple walked up the beach, they found Hernandez hidden in the rocks and called for help. She suffered a brain hemorrhage, 4 fractured ribs, and a fractured collarbone, a collapsed lung, and ruptured blood vessels in both eyes, among other injuries. But above all else, she was grateful to be a lucky survivor.
Come on, City.
Jenna Geese. Freak accidents aren't the only things humans are able to overcome with remarkable luck. Just ask Jenna Geese. When she was 15 years old, Geese was attending Sunday Mass at her local church in Fond du Lac, Wisconsin, when a bat started flying around inside. After an usher stunned it by hitting it with a prayer book, Jenna, being an animal lover, picked it up by its wings and carried it outside. And that's when it sank its fangs into her left finger. You might be thinking, people have survived bites from far more fearsome creatures. But this wasn't just any old bat. It was a rabid bat. For those who don't know, rabies is a nasty viral disease carried by certain animals which can kill a human by compromising the brain's ability to regulate breathing, salivation, and heartbeat. The disease is virtually 100% fatal. Thankfully, there is a vaccine which can be administered to stimulate antibodies to the virus. The vaccine eliminates the chances of getting the disease if it is given in advance, or more commonly, within a few days after the initial exposure. There was only one small problem. Geese didn't get the vaccine. The bite was so quick and small that she thought she had only been scratched. Plus, her fellow churchgoers told her only healthy bats could fly, meaning she thought she was safe when it flew away. But 3 weeks later, Jenna noticed that her finger felt a bit numb and tingly. Within a couple of days, she felt tired and nauseous. 24 hours later, she was seeing double and was taken to the hospital, where she arrived semi-delirious and vomiting. Her parents were told she had hours to live. After all, no one had ever survived rabies without a vaccine before. Left with no other choice, Dr. Rodney Willoughby came up with a totally impromptu treatment. He put Geese into an induced coma to give her immune system time to build up antibodies against the virus. A week later, she was slowly brought out of the coma and remained in the hospital for a further 11 weeks, during which time she took 17 pills a day to help her recovery. Full rehabilitation took months to a year, but doctors have since described Geese's survival as historic. In the years since, Geese has been outspoken about her battle and hopes the doctors can refine the experimental treatment to ensure that other victims are given the same chances of survival. Moral of the story, don't go scooping up bats, kids, especially if they've just been smacked by a prayer book.
Be careful. Don't pick up random animals.
A whale of a time.
Oh no.
On Monday, the 2nd of November, 2020, friends Liz Cottrell and Julie McSorley were kayaking at California's Avia Beach when the unthinkable happened. The pair had been watching whales feed on silverfish from a distance of about 9 meters when a large pool of fish emerged around them. McSorley then spotted a large, dark shape coming up from beneath, but it was too late to react before this happened.
No. Damn.
Did anyone else just gasp out loud?
I've seen that story, and seeing that is still scary as hell.
It's like watching a real-life Moby Dick, except this time, thankfully, there's far less tragedy involved. It may look like Liz Cottrell and Julie McSorley were swallowed by this huge humpback whale, but both women actually escaped totally unharmed. As the whale burst out of the water, it lifted the pair and their kayak up into the air before dumping them back down. It's incredible that a nearby kayaker was able to record the entire thing on camera, but what's even more amazing is that McSorley also happened to be filming at the time and caught it from her own perspective.
No.
I don't know about you, but she sounds awfully calm for someone who was almost swallowed by a whale. Thankfully, most whales, with the exception of the sperm whale, have throats that are too small to swallow a large mammal the size of a human, and there's no records of such a thing ever happening. Assuming you were swallowed in one piece, the whale wouldn't be able to tear you to pieces because whales don't have teeth, so to speak. Instead, they have baleen plates, which are covered with hair that is able to filter krill from the thousands of liters of water these huge creatures swallow in one gulp. The biggest danger would either arise from being squashed by the whale's sheer weight or being dragged down too fast enough to a depth where your lungs experience a thoracic squeeze and collapse completely. Thankfully, these ladies only lost their car keys and not their lives. I hope they called a cab home because I'd be in no rush to get on another boat.
Can't do
Lisa
no boat.
Mondi. Ever get that uneasy feeling while swimming in the ocean like you're mere feet away from a great white at any time? Thankfully, those fears are usually just thanks to your brain playing tricks on you. In fact, according to the International Wildlife Museum, the odds of being attacked and killed by a shark are around 1 in 1.75 million.
Not
Those
low
chances
enough.
are lower than the possibility of dying by a lightning strike, a freak firework accident, or excessive cold. But not everyone is safe.
Oh
Just
boy.
ask Lisa Mondi. In March 2011, 24-year-old Lisa was a wildlife tour guide making the most of a sunny lunch break by wakeboarding with friends when she failed to land a jump and the board came off her feet. Lisa started treading water as she waited for the boat to turn around and pick her up when a great white shark sped straight up at her from below. The creature hit her so hard it launched her about 3 feet out of the water as its powerful jaws closed around her head and arm.
No.
The shark dragged Lisa underwater, but lost its grip of her, and thanks to her life jacket, she was able to come back up to the surface. Lisa was then rushed to the hospital in Port Stevens, where doctors feared they would have to amputate her left arm because she had lost so much muscle, as well as her brachial artery, which is a major blood vessel. Miraculously, after undergoing numerous operations, she was able to leave the hospital with her arm heavily bandaged up, but crucially, still attached to her body. Even more remarkably, Lisa returned to the water in February 2016 to get a closer look at the predator that almost killed her by going cage diving.
No.
Oh, and did I mention she also smashed a performance of Strong by British band London Grammar on X Factor Australia in 2015? What a survivor. Ron Cooper's lucky escape. Regardless of how much of an experienced driver you are, the open road is full of pitfalls and perils. And if it isn't other drivers you need to be wary of, it's your natural surroundings. In 2014, Australian motorist Ron Cooper proved that sometimes all it takes is lightning-fast reaction times to save your own life. While traveling on the Black Spur Highway near Melbourne, Australia, Cooper was caught in the middle of a wild storm. Dashcam footage shows the trees that line the road swaying slightly as Cooper turns a corner, and leaves and small branches litter the road ahead. And then this happens.
Damn. Damn, nature. You
As
scary.
if blown over by some invisible giant, at least 7 trees fall like a house of cards, right in front of Cooper's car. Thankfully, he was able to think fast enough to slam on the brakes before any of the falling foliage could crush his vehicle, not to mention himself. A car driving in the opposite direction can also be seen stopping just in the nick of time as the trees cover Watts River Bridge. Judging by the footage, Cooper managed to miss the trees by mere inches without breaking a sweat. All it would have taken is a split second more and this freak weather accident would have certainly spelled lights out. And that, my friends, is a much needed lesson on being aware of your surroundings at all times. Alcides Moreno. If you're afraid of heights, window washing probably isn't the right career choice for you. But Alcides Moreno and his brother Edgar clearly had no such fears, as they worked together on high-rise buildings in Manhattan for years. That is until one fateful day in December 2007, when the obvious risks of such a vertigo-inducing career became a terrifying reality. While cleaning the windows of the Salao Tower, an Upper East Side apartment building in Midtown Manhattan, the anchors holding the platform that the two brothers were working on suddenly gave way, sending it and them plummeting 47 stories,
Oh my
almost 500
God.
feet into a narrow alleyway below. This kind of fall should have been game over for anyone, and Edgar sadly lost his life in the accident. But as stunned witnesses rushed over to the scene, they were dumbfounded to find Alcides miraculously alive, conscious, and sitting up. After being rushed to the hospital where he underwent several tricky procedures, as well as receiving around 24 pints of blood and 19 pints of plasma, Alcides was amazingly able to walk and talk again by the following June. But how did he survive such a fall? Alcides has since referred to his job training to explain it. You see, he and his fellow window washers had been given clear instructions about how to try and protect themselves in the event of falling from a great height. Just lay flat and grip the platform tightly. Doctors also noted that he didn't hit his head or break his pelvis upon landing, which are two things most likely to cause fatal complications in a fall like this. Unsurprisingly, Alcides wasn't able to return to his window washing work, but he did receive a sizable settlement after it was revealed that the scaffolding company hadn't secured it properly. Plus, who else can say they've fallen 47 stories and survived?
Fuck.
A damn disaster. The Monticello Dam is a 304-foot-high concrete arc located on Puta Creek where the stream crosses the eastern boundary of Napa County, California. It was constructed between 1953 and 1967 to form Lake Berryessa and regulates flows along the lower reaches of Puta while storing surplus water. But its crowning feature by far is a magnificent spillway known as an Morning Glory Hole, which acts as a massive funnel when water levels rise above 440 feet. At the surface, the spillway measures a whopping 72 feet across.
Like the
Excess
devil's
water
anus.
drops a monumental 200 feet down a narrowing shaft, which tapers to 28 feet in diameter, where it turns 90 degrees and flows into Puta Creek. As you can imagine, falling into this watery chasm isn't something that most people would escape from unharmed. But that's precisely the scenario laid out in descriptions that accompanied a video that made the rounds online in November 2020.
Why would you do something like that?
The video's description claimed the unfortunate soul fell directly into the Monticello Dam in California after being used as a human springboard, with the clip cutting off right before we get to see their fate. But I'm relieved to tell you that, in reality, that terrifying looking tumble wasn't quite what it was claimed to be. You see, despite the video's claims, the location wasn't the Monticello Dam at all. It was the far less dangerous Sapua Dam, found in India, which is a prime spot for camping, sightseeing, and swimming. The name Sapua translates as snake, which reflects the winding architectural structure of this concrete dam. Although the viral video's camera angle makes it look like the guy fell to certain doom, the reality is that he probably only fell around 18 feet into the water below, which is nothing compared to the 200 feet had he really been at California's Monticello Dam.
I've been thinking about that
If anyone were
one.
actually unlucky enough to fall into the Monticello spillway after being sucked into the abyss, they'd likely be battered around the tunnel walls, possibly even drowning in the turbulent current. But while no injuries were reported in relation to the viral video from India, the fellow's fall still could have turned nasty had he got unlucky and struck his head on the dam's concrete masonry. So although the viral clip might not be as terrifying as it once seemed, and its subject was alright, it's safe to say that hanging around any dam is a damn bad idea.
Lady Luck can be a cruel mistress,
Come on,
but
Rick
for
Money.
some ludicrously lucky people, she
Come on,
comes
Rick
just
Money.
when they need her most. From a woman who survived falling 14,500 feet without a parachute
Damn.
to a girl who was frozen solid for a whole night, the following stories of these real-life legends are sure to leave your jaws on the floor.
Damn,
So get ready to shuffle to the edge of your seat as we take a look at even more of the luckiest
turtle?
people
A
who
flying
survived
turtle that
against
came through your
impossible
windshield?
odds.
A flying turtle.
Tree terror.
Oh.
There's nothing more relaxing than chilling out by the pool with a good book, right? Well, back in July 2020, one mother from Georgia found out it can be anything but relaxing. She was casually reading and watching her kids play in the pool when suddenly her son started shouting to her.
Oh, shit. Ooh.
Oh my god, are you okay?
Yep, your baby deserve a raise.
Whoa, she leapt out of the way just in time. That heavy tree splintered and smashed down directly onto the sunbed she'd been lounging on
Nigga.
moments before. If she'd reacted a single second later,
Single second?
they'd have needed an adult-sized spatula to get her off that sunbed.
Yeah, real talk.
Kudos to that kid for the warning.
Run, bitch. Run. Run, bitch.
Dollar Bill Morgan. There's bad luck, there's good luck, and then there's Bill Morgan. Back in 1998, this 36-year-old Australian truck driver was involved in a brutal accident that nearly cost him his life. He survived, but after being rushed to the hospital, he was given a drug that triggered an allergic reaction and sent him into cardiac arrest. His heart stopped for a full 14 minutes. But miraculously, doctors managed to revive him. But sadly, he was completely comatose. For 12 long days, Bill's family waited for any sign of life. Then, just when they were preparing for the worst, Bill woke up. Following a complete recovery, he got engaged to his girlfriend, netted a new job, and later, on a whim, bought a scratch card. Amazingly, he won a car worth 17,000 Australian dollars. Word of Bill's incredible turn of luck got around, and he was asked to reenact his win for Channel 9 News. So he bought another scratch card, the cameras started rolling, and then this happened.
I just won 250,000. I'm not joking.
You're not, are you?
I just won 250,000.
Bill won the jackpot of 250,000 Australian dollars live on air. Rocky. Now that's what I call a twist of fate. Frozen solid. The U.S. state of Minnesota is famous for its numbingly cold winters. However, back in the December of 1980, 19-year-old Jean Hilliard had no idea she was about to prove just how cold they could get, in the most unbelievable way possible. Jean was driving home one evening when she hit a ditch and got stuck. Trying to get the car back up and running on her own was useless, so she got out and started walking to a friend's house down the road. But Jean hadn't dressed for the cold, and temperatures that night hit a bitter low of minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit. She walked for 2 grueling miles until finally reaching her destination. Only once there, she tripped over. Lacking the energy to stand up with her body rapidly shutting down, she crawled towards the doorstep and, get this, froze completely solid. 6 hours later, her friend, Wally Nelson, opened the door to find what looked like a very lifelike ice sculpture of Jean in his yard. At first, he didn't think she was alive, but then he saw a few bubbles coming out of her nose. Somehow, she was still breathing. He quickly got her to a hospital, but her condition perplexed all the doctors there. Her eyes didn't respond to light, and her body didn't register on a thermometer because it was that cold. They couldn't even get an IV drip into her arm. The needles kept snapping on her hard skin. With no idea what else to do, they put heat pads along her body and waited. A few hours passed, and somehow, miraculously, Jean opened her eyes. Another few hours, and to her parents' delight, she could talk coherently. So how did she escape being literally frozen solid with no permanent damage? Well, it's possible that this was a case of extreme hypothermia. And though there's no real data on it, there are dozens of cases just like Jean's. When a person's body cools down below freezing temperatures, their blood flow slows, and their body requires less oxygen, like a kind of hibernation. One doctor has theorized that when a frozen person is warmed back up, and their blood flow increases at the same rate as their temperature rises, they can recover. This may well have been what saved Jean's life. Either that or she's the real-life Elsa, and this was just the first manifestation of her ice powers.
Real talk.
Crazily, both theories seem just as likely.
I can see that.
Fire ant
freefall.
Skydiving is the kind of thing I've always wanted to do, but never had the guts to actually go through with.
I ain't doing
but North Carolinian Joan Murray had no such problem.
I ain't gonna
Back
front.
in 1999, Joan had already completed an impressive 35 jumps. So, as she stood in the plane 14,500 feet in the air and prepared for her 36th jump, she wasn't nervous. She wasn't even nervous when she opened the plane doors, leapt straight out, and started free-falling down to Earth at 120 miles per hour.
There you go.
However, when she tried to pull her parachute, something happened that made her very nervous. It wouldn't come out. Refusing to panic, Joan reached for the reserve chute and tugged hard. With relief, she felt it leap from her bag, expand out, and jerk her into a slow descent.
That's good.
But then she started spinning in a circle, tangling the chute's cords in a knot behind her. No matter how hard she tried to pull against the force, she only spiraled faster and faster, losing all control. It was no good. Joan rocketed towards the cold, hard ground at a bone-crunching 80 miles per hour.
Oh, no.
She hit the earth, heard a loud crack, and everything faded to black.
Why would you show
Joan
us that?
fell into a coma, and after being taken to a hospital, she underwent copious reconstructive surgeries and blood transfusions.
Yeah, it probably broke
the
her vagina.
The whole right
That's
side of her body had been crushed.
What did her vagina look
it
like?
wasn't looking
was her
good.
vagina safe?
And then, after 2 weeks, she woke up and went on to make a full recovery.
She's already...
How was this even remotely possible?
Her vagina's already
Well,
through.
by complete
You know what I mean?
chance,
She's already...
Joan had crash-landed on a fire ant nest.
That's not better.
The venomous ants immediately started crawling all over her,
That's not better.
biting and stinging her about 200 times.
That's not good.
Their venom, called solanopsin, stimulates the nervous system, and the ants injected Joan with so much of the stuff that it kept her heart beating until the ambulance arrived.
God Lord.
Incredibly, the whole experience didn't knock her passion for plunging, and she later went on to complete a 37th skydive.
The lie detector detected
You could
that
say
was a
that
lie.
her story had a bit of an anti-climax.
No.
Avalanche escapes.
Not doing that.
Now, my ideal vacation involves a tropical island, a good book, and bottomless
And good
cocktails.
breasts.
Though some people prefer to
great
be a bit
personality.
more
Female with
adventurous,
good personality.
like this serious skier in the French Alps. They look like they're having a blast, but while slaloming
born-again
down the
virgin. I
slope,
don't do
they
dirty
accidentally aggravated the snow,
No matter
causing a
how
small
complete and
avalanche.
agreeable their breasts are. Damn. Ooh, shit. Yep, you getting your ass whooped. There it is. Ooh, I mean, it could be worse. No, it can't. That's not good. Okay, that's better.
Oh, I'd have panicked so bad, but this guy didn't even let go of his GoPro despite a nasty bump with a tree.
Damn.
After crashing to the ground and riding the snowslide down, luckily he slowed and came to a stop. But often avalanches like this carry such momentum that anyone caught up in them is whisked to the bottom and buried. And this is a danger one group of friends found out the hard way.
Uh-oh.
While riding snowmobiles in the Uinta Mountains, Utah, the group suddenly felt a massive rumble. Sure enough, a huge avalanche was crashing towards them. Thinking they were far enough away from it, one of them started filming. Their friend at the base of the mountain raced off out of frame and escaped, but the cameraman underestimated just how far the avalanche would go.
Nigga, hold on now. Ride this motherfucker. Ride. Speed, bitch. Yo. Yep, this ain't what I wanted. This ain't good.
You good?
Are we?
Yep.
We're alive? All of us? Shit. Word?
Yep, you good? I'm out.
In a
The
good way?
super scary footage shows them getting completely buried under the freezing snow.
Go,
With
nigga!
a lot of wriggling and kicking, though, they eventually freed themselves
I'd
and
have been
lived
out.
to tell the tale. And while that's cause for comfort, I think I'll stick to my book and bottomless cocktails, thanks.
I just stick to video games. I don't even need
Bathtub
the cocktails.
joyride.
give
Being
me the
caught in
video
a
games.
storm can be a pretty terrifying experience. Usually you're safe inside your house unless you live somewhere prone to tornadoes. Back in 2017, 75-year-old Charlesetta Williams and her
Charles?
son, Ricky,
Ew,
were
bitch.
watching TV in their home in Marion County, Texas, when they heard the loud ruckus of an approaching storm. And in Marion County, storms mean tornadoes. Expecting the worst, Ricky led his mom upstairs to the bathroom and helped her into the tub before climbing in himself. A bathtub is actually one of the best places you can go in a storm if you don't have a bunker, because they're heavy and firmly anchored to the water pipes. At least, that's the theory. Within minutes, there was a loud, thunderous roar as the storm hit the house and ripped straight through it. The roof of the house was suddenly torn off, and Ricky and Charlesetta held on for dear life. The whole porcelain tub shook violently. Then, unbelievably, it was wrenched from the floor and picked up above the wreckage of their house. They rose higher and higher, spinning around in the air alongside bits of roof and furniture. Then the tub flipped over, and they were flung down onto the ground. Miraculously, they both landed with only a few cuts and bruises, even though their house was a pile of rubble. Now that's a crazy story, no matter how you spin it.
No King Von, because he was hella spinning
Stephen
blocks.
Callahan can. If there's one thing worse than being caught in a storm on land, it's being caught in a storm at sea. Back in 1981, experienced sailor Stephen Callahan set sail from Rhode Island, U.S., and was en route to Antigua when one night the weather got wild. During the chaos, Stephen's small boat hit what he thought was a whale and started to sink. Thinking quick, Stephen blew up his 6-foot-wide inflatable life raft, but he needed supplies if he was to survive out in the middle of the ocean. As his boat sank below the surface, Stephen dived underwater and was able to grab a spear gun, an emergency kit, navigation charts, and a few other essentials. Then he pulled himself onto the raft and drifted away across the lonely expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. Forced to go wherever the waves took him, Stephen was sent westward. He made drinking water from solar stills he'd salvaged from the boat, which used the sun's heat to evaporate and distill salt water, and ate rations from the emergency kit. These didn't last long, though, and when they ran out, Stephen was forced to use his spear gun to catch fish and birds to eat.
Damn,
Out of
birds.
desperation, he even ate barnacles.
What the fuck
Every
is a
day that
barnacle?
went by brought another challenge. He faced shark attacks, raft punctures, lost a whole third of his body weight, and at points he felt like he couldn't go on. But he never gave up. Using his experience at sea and sheer determination, Stephen survived on his own in his tiny inflatable raft for 75 days.
What?
Then, on the 76th, he was finally spotted and brought to shore by some fishermen off the coast of Marie Galante. Almost 3 months since his brutal ordeal began, Stephen was saved.
Damn.
How long do you think you'd last? Never mind 3 months, I'd give myself 3 minutes before I'd start crying like a baby. Tire
At least 6
terror.
minutes.
Some people hate driving down highways. I can see why. They're loud, busy, and often stressful. Whatever your opinion, we can all agree that having a huge tire randomly smash through the ceiling of your car would make the experience significantly worse. And one Brit, while driving down the busy M6 in England, got exactly that. He'd been driving as normal when a truck heading in the opposite direction lost one of its tires. It hurtled across the road, clipped off the central barrier, and smashed straight through the windshield of his car. But it didn't just smash the window, it ripped through the entire roof,
Good Lord.
tearing it straight off before getting lodged in the back seat.
It was going that
Extraordinarily, it somehow missed the driver, despite hitting pretty much everything else.
Yeah.
And he still managed to pull over and stop the car safely. The luckiest part, though, is that just hours before, the driver's young child had been begging to come with him and would have been sitting right where the tire ended up. In what was possibly the best decision he'd ever made, the father said no. Man, I need to get the number of this guy's guardian angel.
Nigga. Damn.
Boulder Dash.
Put Boulder Dash.
The coastal city of Keelung, Taiwan is famously surrounded by tall mountains. Most of the time, they're incredibly scenic and boast some seriously gorgeous views. But on August 31st, 2013, Mother Nature turned them into one heck of a weapon. A driver was heading down one of the mountainside roads when suddenly he was hit by a torrent of debris that came rolling down in a
my God.
landslide, pushing his car off to the side. Then, a huge boulder slammed down after, exactly where the car would have been had it not just been pushed. And the way it just teetered there before settling back down again, it gives me shivers just watching it.
Yeah, me too, bro.
Don't worry, though. Nobody was hurt. The journey just got off to a very rocky start.
Oh, boy.
Screw this. When I was a kid, I always wanted a treehouse, but we never had a tree that was suitable for building one in. After hearing about this next kid's experience, though, I'm pretty glad I never got one. Several years ago, Darius Foreman was building a treehouse in Maryland, US, when he slipped and fell headfirst from one of the branches, right onto a board with a great big screw jutting out of it. His parents rushed outside and called an ambulance. Defying all odds, he was alive, albeit with a plank attached to his head. However, if the screw had gone just a single millimeter more, it would have been a very different story. When the medical helicopter arrived, though, he couldn't fit through the door because the board was too big. Firefighters arrived on scene and sawed a portion of it off from the top. However, they couldn't saw too close to the boy's head or risk nudging the nail and causing more damage. Eventually, another bigger chopper arrived, and Darius was finally flown to a hospital. Once there, doctors carefully removed the rest of the board, and Darius went on to make a full recovery. But thank God they didn't screw up.
I know, right? They didn't screw up. I had it.
Cray Leray.
Oh, Coy Leray.
Anyone who drives knows what a pain breaking down on the side of the road can be. But what if your car broke down in the middle of the Sahara Desert, you had no phone, and only a few days of food and water? This wasn't a hypothetical question, but a stark reality Emile Leray had to face back in 1993.
Why are you out there in the first place?
This adventurous French electrician had decided to take his trusty Citroën 2 CV out exploring across Morocco. When a military blockade barred him from heading the way he wanted to go, Emile took his car off-road and decided to go around the blockade rather than turning back. Big mistake. For a short while, the tough little vehicle withstood the harsh desert landscape. Then, Emile hit a stone, hard, and everything groaned to an unrepairable standstill. Though he had some basic knowledge of the area, Emile was unsure where the nearest village was, and it was too far to hike. So instead of panicking, he came up with a crazy plan. Using his engineering skills, he'd transform his broken car into a motorbike.
Motherfucker, what?
Emile went into survival mode, eating less, drinking less, and focusing purely on the task at hand. First, he removed the shell of the car and used it as a base to store things in. Then, using pieces of it as makeshift tools, he pulled off bits of his car, bent thinner parts, drilled holes using pieces of metal, and salvaged screws, and slowly but surely built something resembling a bike. He worked through intense heat and even raging sandstorms, which he was forced to shelter from in the car's shell. After 12 arduous days, just as he was on his last drops of water, Emile finished his makeshift vehicle. He climbed aboard, hit the gas, and with immense relief rode back across the barren sands towards civilization. But as he triumphantly reached the Moroccan city of Tantan, the police immediately fined him around $1,000 for driving an illegal vehicle. Not exactly the welcome back from the brink party I bet he was hoping for.
I wouldn't be mad at it. Damn.
Carnage. While Emile Leray is a pro at creating vehicles, it seems there are a lot more people out there that are pros at destroying them. Take this Australian driver, for example, who didn't properly secure his load of corrugated metal to the back of his truck before setting off. After braking a little too hard, the metal sheet smashed his back window and ran through the entire left-hand side of the vehicle. This guy is so lucky he was in a right-hand drive car, or these photos would look like they belong in an episode of CSI.
Oh boy.
It's spine-chilling just to think about it.
Oh boy.
But if you're scared of heights, I've got something even more freaky for you.
Can you not?
This picture was taken back in 2006, just outside of Hurricane City, Utah, on State Highway 59. Seems like a fairly standard road accident, right? However, if I zoom out a bit, you'll see it's anything but. For a start, the truck was going so fast it not only smashed through the guardrail and off the road, but launched up in the air and flipped 180 degrees. And it's a good job it did, because otherwise it would have fallen down this. Yep, The driver in that truck vaulted at high speed right over a huge gaping chasm and onto the other side, mere inches away from the stomach-churning drop below. Somehow, both driver and passenger survived with only a few cuts and bruises.
Damn.
I'm not really sure why they call it reckless driving, when the car always ends up wrecked.
Yeah, I'll give him that.
Sniper survivor. There aren't many situations more dangerous than all-out war, so soldiers are trained to expect life-threatening scenarios and deal with them appropriately. Even so, what U.S. Marine Sam Arnold survived in Afghanistan back in 2013 is almost impossible to believe. While scoping out a location, Sam's squad heard gunfire and decided to investigate. Then, this happened. Holy cow. A sniper in the distance fired straight at Sam, with the bullet hitting him square on the helmet. After rushing back to safety, the Marines regrouped. Against all odds, Sam was fine, if a little shocked. In fact, I'd say he took it incredibly well.
Dude, that's through.
All right, let's get out here and do something about this.
It's one thing stopping a shot from a small firearm, but to stop one from a powerful sniper rifle is another matter entirely. Luckily, thanks to a combination of a strong helmet and relatively low-power rifle, Sam Arnold made it out with his life and his underwear fully intact.
Damn that.
What a hero.
Oh,
Crash
wow.
landing. More than 50 million road traffic accidents occur around the world every year. But occasionally, one of those accidents is so crazy it defies belief. When a group of 3 friends were driving in their pickup truck near Johannesburg in South Africa back in 2012, they were suddenly met with a terrifying sight. A small aircraft had spun out of control and was diving down in their direction at an alarming speed. Before anyone could react, the plane smashed into the road ahead, burst into flames, and hurtled towards them at a breakneck pace. The driver of the truck, Monica Braganca, hit the brakes hard and closed her eyes. With a deafening crash, the plane's cockpit blasted straight into the front of the truck. The man in the back seat, Tony van Oswegen, was flung hard through the rear window and landed over 30 feet away.
Dang.
The 2 girls in the front desperately forced their way out of the destroyed vehicle's side windows and started running for their lives. The plane looked like it was about to explode, and there was no time to save the 2 people still inside.
Nope.
But then, out of nowhere, a group of men appeared and heroically dashed to the burning plane. By sheer chance, they'd been freeboarding nearby and heard the crash. Clambering atop the smoking cockpit, one of them reached in through the shattered windshield and undid the pilot's seatbelts. With his friend's help, they pulled them free and together managed to escape the wreckage minutes before the whole thing exploded in a torrent of flames.
Nope.
No, this isn't the plot to the next Mission Impossible movie. Despite the lack of Tom Cruise, everybody lived to tell the terrific tale with no serious injuries. Let's just hope there's not a sequel. Turtle hurdle.
Yeah, turtle
The
hurdle.
chances of a plane crashing into a car are low. But what are the odds a turtle would come crashing down from the heavens?
Nigga.
Well, considering they can't fly, you'd assume 0, right? Well, in Florida, this bizarre phenomenon has happened at least
Mario
twice.
Brothers?
While driving down Interstate 4 in May
One
of
of the turtles from
2016,
Super Mario Brothers go
something
flying
round
by,
suddenly
loses his wings,
slammed
and goes
straight into
straight into your
Nicole
window.
Biana's windshield, shattering glass all over her.
Damn, bitch.
Forced to hit the brakes hard, she came to a screeching stop on the side of the highway. Luckily, she was uninjured. However, when she'd got over the initial shock, she was even more stunned to realize that there was a turtle in the car with her.
Oh boy.
Fortunately, the surprise passenger was okay too. But wait, there's more. In 2021, it happened again.
Who throws a
Only
turtle?
this time, the rapid reptile went straight through the windshield and bonked an elderly lady on the head. Again, thankfully, both parties survived. So what the heck was responsible for the flying turtle
Who's
attacks?
throwing turtles?
Any guesses? Turns out, the little green fellas had been trying to cross the road when their shells had been nicked by passing cars. The force of the car hitting the shell sent the turtles soaring into the air, only to come crashing back down through people's windscreens. So really, it's a lucky escape for both turtle and human. I can only imagine what must have been going through their scaly little heads. Other than the windscreens, of course.
So I like these type of videos because nothing reminds you that your life is actually going pretty well, quite like watching a bunch of other people's whose lives aren't. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. Make sure to come back next time. It's your boy BlastphamousHD, Twisms, and more at 11.